Hello and welcome to Jinnah Institute's series of webinars. Today, we will be discussing the marginalization of religious minorities in Pakistan and how that marginalization manifests itself in different ways. The 2020 People's Under Threat Trends by Minority Rights Group International ranks Pakistan as the 9th worst country where religious minorities are systematically oppressed. While the prevalent discourse does highlight urgent problems like the weaponization of the blasphemy law, the increasing frequency of forced conversions of young Hindu and Christian girls, there is little understanding and acknowledgement of the structural barriers faced by religious minorities when they require interaction with or intervention from state institutions. Looking at one aspect without factoring in the other gives us an incomplete picture of the challenges faced by these communities. This is why today we have two very special guests to discuss the findings of two reports that have been released recently. The first one is a briefing paper that was released in July 2021 by the International Commission of Jurists on the violations of the right to freedom of religion or belief in Pakistan. And the other one is the legal needs assessment of religious minorities in Sindh. Joining us today are Ms. Reema Omer, who is a legal advisor at the ICJ, and Ms. Kashmala Tahir, who is a research coordinator at the Legal Aid Society, and also the lead researcher and author of the legal needs assessment report that we'll be discussing today. Thank you both for joining us to discuss this very pertinent issue. We'll start with Ms. Reema Omer. Most recently, the event that comes to mind is Sialkot, which was extremely tragic. And generally, throughout the year, there have also been multiple cases being discussed both on the news and social media relating to the forced conversions, especially of young Hindu girls. In this assessment that has been released by the ICJ, what are the broader trends that you're witnessing when it comes to the issues that have been highlighted?
Yeah, thank you so much, Abdulla. It's always a very important conversation to have. And I think what you pointed out is really the key issue, that you can't really look at one aspect of the situation in which religious minorities in Pakistan find themselves in without ignoring others. And I think one very important aspect is the history of Pakistan and how religion has been played by various actors, has been, I think, misused. We can go back to the 1950s and we can see the Munir Kayani report, and we can see how religion since then has really been the role of the state, and how the state and the society relate to religion has always been a key issue. And that has been weaponized, it has been politicized. And what we find ourselves in, the situation, is really a result of all that. I always, whenever incidents like Sialkot, tragedies like Sialkot happen, I go back to the Munir Kayani report, and I see so much of it being sort of, in a way, it was a prophecy what the report predicted would happen if we continue down the same path. And it's very unfortunate that even today we don't see our leadership recognizing the issue. Before moving to the specifics, I'll just say that, whether it is the violence we saw by TLP in the name of blasphemy, in the name of the finality of the Prophet, peace be upon him, we always see things as law and order issues alone. We do not understand the foundational issue is different. It is more ideological. It is more about how we have told our people that the identity of Pakistanis is necessarily, that they have to protect Islam. And this fear that we have instilled in our people, that despite being overwhelmingly a Muslim majority country, when 96-97% people are Muslim, there is this attack on Islam in this country. So I think that has to be the foundation of any conversation on religious minorities in the country. Now, the ICJ's report is a bit, I will say, has a narrow focus. It looks largely at the legal issues and the legal framework that relate to minorities. So the first, of course, the instrument that you look at is the Pakistani Constitution and Article 20. Article 20 guarantees the freedom of religion, the right to profess, practice, and propagate religion. And if you look at 2014 judgment by Justice Jilani, who was at that time, I think, was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he's interpreted this very broadly to include thought, to include conscience, and not just specifically religion itself. And he's also said that within religions, various sects have the right to practice their faiths, and the state has to encourage it. The state has to make it possible, implementable, practicable. So that judgment is a must read if someone is just venturing into this issue, because it really reflects how international law looks at the freedom of religion or belief. I mean, we also, say FOB, religion or belief, but it's actually a much broader right. It includes conscience, it includes thought. So I think that's the first thing. The other, we also, of course, have to look at the ICCPR and how FOB is defined in that. And then we move to various issues. Now, blasphemy, in my opinion, I'll just say that for me is a key issue. Around 80 people since 1990 have been killed in the name of blasphemy in Pakistan. Just a blasphemy allegation makes you vulnerable to attack, to murder. I mean, this is something that we can't really deny anymore. It's well documented. The situation before the blasphemy law was made more stringent in the 1980s and before, after. So I think that is a key issue, but there is no political will to address it. There are certain concerns, there are certain risks associated with it, that to the extent that even in this conversation that we're having today, perhaps we won't be able to go into the details of where the problems lie. But at least we can speak about the fact that the blasphemy law is terribly misused in Pakistan. We have judgments by the Supreme Court where the court has said that people who are accused of blasphemy, they suffer beyond repair. We need safeguards to make sure that the law is not abused. Then, of course, we have the rights of Ahmadis, and we can speak about this later, who find themselves in a situation where they are, but they're also not minorities, to the extent that the Minorities Commission, the inclusion of an Ahmadi member, was made such a huge issue because people just don't want to consider Ahmadis minorities, but they are also minorities as per the constitution. So where do the Ahmadis, where do they belong? That is, I think, a fundamental question again. Then another issue that has come up, and that is forced conversions. And we can speak about that in detail later. But I just want to say that in a society like ours, where one religion, in this case Islam, is so dominant, and religious minorities in other domains of life are persecuted, conversions, we really need to understand them better. How do we understand a conversion that is forced? If someone sees converting to the dominant religion as the means of improving one's life, one's socioeconomic conditions, is that coercion? There's a lot of interesting jurisprudence internationally on this. So perhaps all these issues are intertwined, but we can look at them one by one as we move along in this conversation.
Great. Thank you so much for that overview and setting that context. And now I'd like to move on to Ms. Kashmala Tahir. And as we said, we want to look at both the aspects. We want to also shed some light on the structural barriers that are faced. So the legal needs assessment report that has been released recently, there is mention of hurdles such as finding employment, participation in politics, claiming basic rights, citizenship, seeking redress from courts. Based on your research on this, Kashmala, could you please share with us a summary of the findings and the nature of the challenges that are faced by religious minorities in Sindh?
Thank you for having me, Abdullah. So the basic premise of this report is the legal needs assessment survey we conducted, which has a long history. It's been used all over the world since 1930s, but it hasn't been used in Pakistan since. We were only once participant to World Justice Project's report, and it was conducted in Karachi, Islamabad, and Lahore. But again, it was not done with a specific community, like we have focused on religious minorities, and also it was done in the 3 largest cities of the country. So you can assume that there might be a difference in results and varying results that you might be getting. So our study is primarily based on 8 districts within Sindh. We have Karachi, but then we have much remote areas like Sangar and Nawab Shah also. What we found was that we talk a lot about criminal issues, right? Especially for religious minorities. I know that much of important research like Ms. Reema's research on forced conversions and blasphemy. These are all very important conversations. But in all honesty, I feel like at some point, the larger focus just relates to these problems. Like these are the only problems that are facing the minorities. These are very big problems, but we also need to look at the structural barriers also. So as legal needs assessment goes, we focus more on civil issues rather than much more criminal ones. So for our survey, just to give a broad overview, we categorize the problems that face these minority communities into 14 distinct categories. They range from consumer issues, for example, your BAPTA issues, your billing errors, all the way up to much more grave issues like that of forced conversion and blasphemy. In the middle, you also have aspects of abuse by state officials, which directly deals with the lack of trust in police or other administrative bodies. And then you have public services, for example, do you have right to citizenship? Do you have rights to a Nadra card? And then what happens? Your right to an employment opportunity. Most importantly, your right to a respectful employment opportunity and your rights to education. So when we conducted a survey, our top 5 problems were all civil problems that they face. These were consumer issues, community rights, for example, places of worship and your graveyards that should be designated to every individual community. You had lack of provision to Nadra cards, you have abuse by state officials, and then you also had problems related to land. What we found was that there was an overwhelming lack of trust in the justice system. People believe that this is a problem that is within our community, so we should keep it in our community. We should solve it through informal means rather than go to court because, they won't understand our problem. They're not part of us. This eventually just leads the marginalized community to become secondary citizens, right? Muslims are first and then everybody is rest. So our problem is not as important as any Muslim's problem would be. That in turn relies to a very heavy reliance on the informal justice system, right? So what we found out, like when we went in the field, our initial hypothesis was that when we asked them, why do you think you face this problem? Many people would say that because they are from a religious minority community. I would come back to the use of the word minority in a while. But that was actually not the case. Most of them said that yes, your lack of your religious identity is there, but that is already an exacerbator of poverty. The main problem is that we're poor, so we don't have access to justice. This what we call the religion poverty nexus. It starts from the lack of identity. For example, especially for our Christian communities, they have a lot of seemingly Muslim sounding names, right? So when they go to a Nadra office, they just automatically they have it in the brain to register them as Muslims. Because even though we are 97% of the population, there is the rest 3% also, right? That you cannot completely negate off. So when you've just written that you're a Muslim, and then they have to go back to redeem that error, which in itself is a very long and tedious process. So the first is, if you put yourself in that situation, you're a Christian and you go and you have been wrongly recorded as a Muslim on your CNIC card, and you go and you're like, oh no, I'm a Christian. The first question is, are you converting? And you can't do that, because that's not allowed. So correcting that is in itself a long and tedious process. When you don't have a Nadra card, which most of our respondents did not, because they came from a low social class, they have dearth of opportunities. You will not be given admission into a school because you don't have a CNIC card. It's a problem that you're constantly stuck in. You won't get access to employment or any other thing. All of that in turn limits your social mobility, right? You cannot even escalate up in the social ladder, and all of this leads to a lack of awareness. So when you're constantly stuck in this problem loop, the end result is that you're not aware about your social as well as your legal needs, which was one of the most major findings. Was their problem a legal one to begin with? When we asked them that, do you think their problem is a legal one? They said no. They think it's just bad luck. So when a person does not even think that their problem is a legal one to begin with, in no circumstance they would go to court, because they have a predetermined solution for the problem. But if I don't think it's a legal one to begin with, I will not use any formal litigation method. All of this, then we also, other factors, even if you know that it's a legal problem, like 71% of our respondents who knew, they said that the organizational procedure was so long and was so difficult to understand. They don't know what the motasib ala is. They don't know that should they go to a family court, should they go to a civil court, should they go to a criminal court, what would happen. They don't even know that how to get a lawyer or what to actually expect of the whole justice system. So it's so difficult, and it's again with the whole problem, Rupna, they don't have education, they don't understand the nitty gritty of things. So, and they're already stuck in an already complicated system as a whole. Furthermore, there's also the cost. Now, if we come from an affluent and a good moderate socioeconomic background, we wouldn't consider cost that they would. For example, much of our respondents were from interior Sindh, and they are daily wage earners. Going to court actually means that they have to give up a day's earning minimum, and then that could, we know that court processes are long and they can go over months and years, and that how many days of earning would I give up if I was in that situation? So I just say, oh, let it go. कोई फायदा नहीं है इसका. I will just like, there's no end result that I see, right? And also the other costs, obviously lawyers are very expensive. There are other menial costs that you and I wouldn't even consider. Then again, we also have a very glaring gender stigma, which I believe we'll also further talk about. Also, we see that the discrimination has varying socioeconomic impacts, right? And it's stratification, there's a lot of socioeconomic stratification. We saw that younger people of these marginalized community were much more skeptical of the justice system than the older counterparts. The older people were, in that mode of pre-Zia era, what used to be, we were in a very good position. But since the younger generation has not seen that supposedly good era, they are not nostalgic of it. Secondly, we also have your caste and your ethnicity. Someone sitting in Lahore, Punjab, and someone sitting in Tharparkar, even though they're both Hindus, will have very different overview of the justice system and their experiences within it, because one is from the most progressive province of the country, and one is from a region that is hardly paid any attention to. Then within these communities, you also have further stratification in terms of caste. We had respondents from all of, for example, Hindu caste, from the Brahmins to the Shudra community. Now, our Brahmin respondents said that they did not face their problem because of their religious identity. They had some other reasons. While the Shudra community said that yes, their religion identity was the main motivating factor behind their problems. And then we conducted a lot of focus group interviews, had a qualitative and quantitative aspect to this whole research. And we found that even, you have political representation, you have seats that are assigned for these minority communities. However, people who said that people who climb up that political ladder or who do get that political representation, they're from the richer part of the community, right? And then slowly they become part of the system that is upholding the discrimination. So since they're part of the system, they will not work to disable it. So there's also a lot of, it's not only Muslims versus non-Muslims, it's also within the communities, there's a lot of stratification that we haven't to take into account. So yeah, I think that is the crux of what our research was about.
Thank you so much for that. And we will just come back to, as you mentioned, the stratification as, we'll focus more on how marginalization is experienced differently along the lines of caste, class, and gender as well. But going back to you, Ms. Reema, Omer, you mentioned Article 20 and also the landmark judgment. Could you also speak a little bit more about how Article 20 has been interpreted differently on occasions, especially depending on the minority in question, Ahmadis, for instance?
Yeah, so I just want to say I'm very conscious of the fact that at least I do not represent a religious minority. So there is that, groups who are from the communities we're talking about, perhaps they would have a far deeper understanding of the issues. But so I will stick mostly to the law, which is what I focus on. But I'm very conscious of also of the fact that that is a myopic way to look at an issue such as this. But it is also easier not maybe in Pakistan's context, but it shows where the state is going, how the state views a particular issue, because the constitution and the laws that we have, they sort of set the the foundations of our state and society in many ways. So in a way, when you look at a country's treatment of religious minorities, perhaps an easy starting point is looking at the constitution and looking at the laws. The actual situation, of course, is always far more complex, and the issues are not just always legal. So Article 20, there is one judgment, Zahiruddin judgment. It's from the 1990s. It's a very, very problematic judgment. It relates to the rights of minorities, particularly Ahmadis, and we see a lot of violence against this particular community, and that judgment in a way condones it. It says, if you hurt the sentiments of Muslims, of course they will respond. It sort of gives legitimacy to laws that fundamentally violate the right to practice religion of Ahmadis. It's a very unfortunate judgment. Like I said, it views the religion as a sort of copyright issue. It does not go into detail about what it means to have a religion, issues of privacy. It gives the state a very, very invasive role in determining people's religions. It's astonishing, really, how much power it gives the state to just get involved in such a private part of a person's life. But then we also have judgments like the judgment I referred to earlier, Justice Jilani's judgment, which really interprets the right to freedom of religion or belief the way it should be. And it gives some very concrete recommendations on how the state should deal with the various issues that religious minorities face. The problem is that judgment is more, it's based largely on principles, on interpretation of Article 20. If in another case, a court has to apply, in an actual given case, has to apply and interpret Article 20, I do not know how they will respond. Maybe even within our judiciary, there is so much difference in how judges view religion and the state's role in getting involved in religious matters, that perhaps you would see different judgments, and it's understandable. Also, how Article 20 has been interpreted in blasphemy cases. I mean, we really don't see any mention of Article 20. It's just very set in stone that this is what Muslims believe and this is what they don't believe. I mean, there is no question of debate on that issue. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, around, I think, 10 years ago, there was some political will to address these issues, but now I don't see any political will at all to even do away with some very blatant procedural issues that are there in blasphemy prosecutions. I mean, also judges, they're fearful. So we don't know when it comes to these issues how far their judgments reflect their interpretation of the law and the constitution, and how far they're just a result of pressure and various influences. I've been in conversation with many judges where they say, we get letters, we are told that our families are being monitored. So there is that issue of just how independent judges are when it comes to these issues, given the larger problems that we spoke about relating to the use of religion for politics in Pakistan. Again, I also want to speak about how the law can be made, the law is of course one aspect of it, but just consider the doctrine of legality. I mean, this is a legal principle that all criminal laws have to be drafted in a way that people know what is criminal and what is not criminal behavior. Just a very simple thing, that criminal laws have to be clearly worded. Now you look at our blasphemy laws and they are drafted in the most vague language I've seen in legal instruments. I think in all the laws I've studied across the world, they are so vague. There is no element of intention. Even the federal Sharia court said blasphemy has to be a reckless or intentional offense, but that's not reflected in our laws. So there are various issues relating to just the law, and which we just don't address because of fear, and because maybe a lot of people just are not that inclined to delve into this area which they believe is controversial. Maybe they believe in it. I'm not sure, but again, the question is not something like blasphemy. It impacts not just religious minority communities, but everybody. It is this large sort of, as you know, sword hanging over everybody in Pakistan. And perhaps a lot of people are not, some, you know, if you ask people who belong to religious minority communities, I'm not sure if how they would respond to it, and how fearful they are, you know, in given that life, there's so many other issues that sort of, especially these days, the social economic issues that one faces, they overwhelm you. And I don't know how far they would consider blasphemy to be the most important issue or the biggest hurdle. But when you look at Pakistan's legal framework, I think it really is very glaring, because I do not see how it is consistent with Article 20 of the Constitution. And also how courts have interpreted it. Some of them have interpreted it, the blasphemy provisions, even more, you know, given them more a larger ambit than even what the laws themselves are for. I mean, those judgments are just astonishing, that even questioning the blasphemy law could be blasphemy. I mean, so it's this situation is worrying. And why I say that it has to be part of such conversations is because the state can do something about it very easily. I mean, if it had the will, it's just a question of amending the laws. It's a question of improving the procedure, giving protection to the lawyers and the people who are the defendants in such cases, not to put them in solitary confinement. Once they are, you know, in blasphemy cases, the Supreme Court, especially in 295C cases, has not upheld a single conviction. Yet so many people, dozens of people, spend years and years in prison just waiting for their turn, so that they you know, the high courts or the Supreme Court end up acquitting them. But in that, so many lives are lost. So it's not just the violence outside the legal system or the vigilante, what people in government say, it's vigilante justice or vigilantism. It's not just that. Even if you go through the legal process, it is injustice at every level. But we see the government not doing anything about it. So that for me is really worrying. And again, it goes back to the issue that some people in government, they say they're hostage to these groups, and they really can't do anything. So it makes one question whether in the government itself, and you know, whether it can, what kind of protection can one expect from the state if they are acting like they're hostage to groups who are outside the state, but are so powerful that the government has to bend the knee and just, you know, it's completely ineffective when it comes to these issues. So this is why, while, but I do completely agree with what Kashmala was saying, that day-to-day lives of people who are not Muslim in Pakistan, there's so many other issues that they face that are not maybe specifically speaking legal issues. They don't, but they just, there is a relationship though there, because the way the Constitution, in my view, it protects the freedom of religion or belief, but in many ways it does make people citizens of this country who are not Muslim, it does make them second-class citizens in many ways. So there is that contradiction within our Constitution, because it gives a certain religion, you know, fundamental importance. It recognizes its special place. There are various provisions that are all about protecting the Islamic way of life, etc. But then you also have some recognition that there is freedom of religion or belief. So there is that contradiction. And, you know, through the objectives resolution, which is now part of the Constitution, you see that inconsistency, that contradiction that then plays out also in society. So there is always, that connection, I feel, that exists.
Thank you so much for giving us the legal context to this. And it's unfortunate how the atmosphere of intimidation has only gotten more severe. One wonders if the 2014 judgment could have been written today
Yeah,
and how it would be
absolutely.
received.
Yep.
But coming back to you, Kashmala, and picking up where we left. So we were talking about how marginalization varies based on factors such as gender, social class. I think for our audience, it would be really helpful to understand from a gendered lens how marginalization is experienced and perceived. If you could shed some light on it.
Yeah. Sorry, I have a lot of light on me for some reason. Okay. So we know that women in Pakistan are already a victim of patriarchy, right? So when we talk about women from religiously marginalized communities, there's a double or even a triple layer of discrimination. First, they're a victim of patriarchy. Second, they're from a religiously marginalized community. And thirdly, they're from a low socioeconomic class. So all of this combines just keep adding to their disadvantages that they're facing in a legal capacity as well as social. For example, when a woman from a religious community, if they face any problem, they are pressured by their communities to solve the problem within themselves, because going to court will only bring shame. And now in saying that, that is not only particular to religious minority communities, but rather to women in Pakistan as a whole, right? So women, again, talking about structural barriers, we know that women avoid going to court because they're harassed. And even on a very fundamental level, there are no places to sit, there are no female bathrooms, there are no place for mothers. How are women supposed to approach the court? They're harassed more. Like, you can be harassed within the court or within a police station, and these are places that are supposed to protect you as citizens of the state. But if that is not happening, and you're already from a community that is marginalized, then that just adds to it abundantly, right? So in one of our focus group discussions, I'm just talking about the kind of level and extent of fear that they face. My focus group respondent mentioned, and I quote, "Court jane se behtar hai insaan mar jaye." Like, she was very blatant in saying that I would rather die than I would not want to go to court, because again, the only place that we saw these women more open to going court was regarding their family issue matters, because this is where both the parties have failed to reach an agreeable solution within the community, right? So there are a lot of topics about child custody, marriage, divorce, all of that then comes into play, because this is where the community will mostly want to take the side of the man, but according to the law, there's also a difference that the custody of the child should go to the mother. There's a lot of discussion about Christian marriage and divorce law that we've been following since British era, and they haven't been revised. So there's a lot of political and power structures that come in play, because it's about separation, or is it about marriage? What does what do the female members of the minority community want? What do the male? Because within these communities, there's also like a power dynamic that's going on, right? So yes, in totality, I think the whole crux that I keep coming back to is that there is discrimination on our outward level. It's within the religious minority versus majority, and then it becomes within the community. It's just like a female Hindu or a female Christian, and a male Hindu and a male Christian, a rich Hindu and a rich Christian, a rich Hindu or a poor Christian. So all of this is playing a part in legal system. And in saying that, the legal system, I think, as what I've figured out through all of this research, is that as also Ms. Reema said, we can't look at it just from the legal point. We can't look at it just from the social point. We have to have a holistic interpretation, and that is only how we'll be able to actually see and fully understand and comprehend the bigger picture that is at play here.
Great, thank you so much for that. Now I know we're short on time, so I'll just ask Ms. Reema Omer the final question for her. So the ICJ report, the section on forced conversions, it points out that NGOs and religious minority groups have documented a strong correlation between reports of forced conversions and child marriages. Could you please highlight how the state has failed to implement and enforce laws relating to abduction, child marriage, forced marriages? We know that, of course, Sindh does have a minimum legal age requirement. In the rest of the country, it's, I think, 16 for girls and 18 for boys. So वो 18 वाली चीज सिर्फ Sindh में exist करती है. But even though we do have the Child Marriage Restraint Act, the interpretation and implementation of the law leaves a lot to be desired. So if you could please speak to that for a bit. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually an area where we need a lot more conversation on and a lot more research on, because now forced conversion has become something a lot of people speak about internationally, you know, in meetings on Pakistan, in conferences on Pakistan. This is always raised as an issue that's urgent. It needs to be addressed. But to be honest, we need more information. And I think this is why even groups who work on forced conversion, they have asked the government to form a task force. And there is actually a committee that is looking at this issue, but their findings really until now, and there is a bit of mistrust as to how that committee views these issues. But we need at all levels some meaningful dialogue and research on this, because even of course, it's so difficult to monitor these things. It's so difficult to track, to document. But we have some very shocking studies which show case studies which show that the state's role has been either completely absent or it's been complicit, and this various state actors have actually sided with perpetrators in many of these cases. Now, why the link between child marriage, forced marriage, and forced conversion? Because by and large, cases of forced conversion that are reported, the victim is a young girl, a young woman. Most forced conversions are followed by marriage. There have been some cases where there have been forced conversions in the context of bonded labor, but by and large, the studies that we have right now, they show this connection. Young women from religious minority communities are forcibly converted, then they're forcibly married to Muslim men. This again shows what the patriarchal nature of Pakistani society, what Kashmala was talking about, that essentially women in all of this, they become a means through which, unfortunately, these power relations are further established. That, you convert a girl from a minority community, bring her to the majority fold, and the men from the majority religion marry them, they have offspring, so on. I mean, this is something that is well documented, has been happening for a long time, and it's playing out in Pakistan as well. The problem is that there is now a call to prohibit or to ban forced conversions. My concern with that is that we could end up with another law that is not implemented, because currently as well in Sindh, a lot of forced conversions, especially of Hindu girls, are reported in Sindh. But there is already a law that a girl who is less than 18 years of age cannot be married. So why is it that that law is not being implemented the way it should be? Why are these marriages taking place in the first instance, right? So if you have another law, how are you going to implement that, especially in this context where you see that various state actors are not interested in tackling the problem? Perhaps they have internalized this is a good thing that minority women, girls from minority communities are being brought into the dominant fold. So without all of this, I just wonder whether a law prohibiting forced conversions is going to work. Another problem with that is that how are you going to define forced conversion? That for me is a key issue, because we have to also remember that the right to convert is part of the right to profess and practice one's religion. So and internationally, there's jurisprudence that if you make it very difficult for people to convert, have so many hurdles, place so many hurdles that they really can't convert, or it makes it very difficult for them to convert, that is a violation of one's right to freedom of religion or belief. So how do you balance these two things? Because there's a very real concern that girls, especially young women, are being forcibly converted, but at the same time, there could be a situation where one willingly converts and wants to marry someone who is from a different religion, maybe Muslim. How do you protect the rights of those girls who are doing this willingly, and at the same time also ensure that no one is being forcibly converted? Because the problem is, once you're forcibly converted, how, what Kashmala earlier spoke about, going back or to one's earlier religion is going to be, is, I'm sure people wouldn't even think of it in Pakistan, given the issues that it raises, and how people would respond from the majority community to this. What happens within your family? I mean, whether these young girls, these young women, they have the kind of legal help that they need so that they understand what the law provides for them, or they're in a situation that they just don't know what remedies are available to them. Often, the problem with our law currently, even on child marriage, is that the marriage does not become void. So you can penalize people for marrying young girls. You can penalize the people who sort of who the qari, or people who jo nikah padhate hain. I mean, you can penalize them, but the marriage is still valid. So if you're married and you end up having children, what options do those young women have? I mean, is divorce is a taboo? They can't leave. If they have children, what is going to happen? So it's like such a complex scenario that I actually think, unless we have a lot more conversations on this, we have more actual research on this, it's very difficult to come up with meaningful recommendations. Just to give the few case studies that we have on this, the girls are under so much pressure. This is also, we have to see how this plays out in terms of the dominant religion overwhelmingly also dominates state institutions, your police force, your judges. And in all of that, there isn't really that much will to understand where this girl is coming from, what the situation was, under what context did she convert, did she agree to marry, and so we also see some of these cases where these girls just they're forced in a way to say yes, they married out of their own will, and that is used by various other people to argue that the issue of forced conversion is blown out of proportion. It's really not an issue in Pakistan, and they use these examples. But if you actually look at how these cases play out, when in private, when they're speaking to their family members, these girls do admit to the coercion that they faced. But in front of public, in front of judges, their response is different, because we have to remember these are young girls, most of them teenagers. So unfortunately, they end up becoming they also don't know what to do, and the coercion and the intimidation and the pressures that they face at such a young age, it just leaves them with few options. And their family members, I mean, they also have very little that they can do. And we see, if even in cases where it's not people from minority communities, when young girls are getting married against the law, the state doesn't really do much. We have very few cases where such marriages are actually stopped. So if it's a religious minority community, I mean, it just adds to those issues. So my first recommendation would be to implement the minimum age of marriage. But again, Abdullah, I'm sorry, but when it comes to legal issues, it's not very clear what the recommendation can be, because there are pros and cons to both. If you invalidate the marriage, if the marriage becomes void, what happens if they're children? What happens in a society like ours? A girl has lived with a man for a few days, and the law says the marriage is void. What happens? Because we are living in a patriarchal society. There are all sorts of questions that come up. But my concern is that it seems as if the issue of forced conversion is just not taken seriously. You see a lot of this counter campaign that this is just NGO led sort of a conspiracy against Pakistan. There is no evidence to support it, and such cases are actually girls marrying Muslim men out of their free will, and some cases are just used. A few cases are used as evidence of this. This is very, very dangerous, because don't you know how difficult it would be to document something like this? I mean, so what really does the government want? It's just very, very astonishing for me that, like most issues here also, it seems like you just don't want to acknowledge it exists, while pretty much every group that works on the rights of minorities in this country, people from the community, this is a big issue that they're raising. But again, what Kashmala was saying, there is an issue of patriarchy within minority communities as well. So there could be cases, a few maybe, I'm not sure, where maybe families would not want their daughters to, even out of choice, marry Muslim men. Because it's not like in Pakistan, marrying out of one's own will, especially for women, is encouraged. So to expect something different from minority communities would be perhaps unrealistic. So there is that angle. But my one recommendation on this would be to take this issue seriously and to actually have meaningful dialogue. And for something like this, you need the state's help so that you can access data into these figures of how many people are getting married from religious minority communities, at what age. So you can have something more concrete to work with. But this dismissal that we see right now, and this counter campaign that this is just a sort of an NGO or Western agenda to defame Pakistan, as we always see when we speak about religious minorities here, that really needs to stop.
Of course, no, as you said, इतने पहलू हैं इसके forced conversions के untangle करते करते, you know, we can, I guess, perhaps, I mean, it's not just the legal issues, definitional जो आपने point out किए हैं, and even when it comes to the framing of the issue, I think perhaps we can have you over just to discuss this issue in and of itself, because it
एक मैं छोटी सी बात और कर दूं. I feel a bit, I'm sorry, I'm taking too much time. Please. Another recommendation that comes up is that 18 साल से कम उम्र में conversion, you know, just prohibit blanket terms में that children should not be able to convert. Now, from an international law perspective, that is problematic, because children too have the right to practice, profess their religious belief. And hame dekhte examples of, you know, that children can't drive before a certain age, they can't vote. So why should they be allowed to change their religion? That is not the right comparison, because you already have a religion. You know, it's not a right that you acquire after a certain age. So if you prohibit children from converting before 18, you will be forcing them to live in a religious identity that is not theirs. So while we must have robust legislation against forced conversions, we must have very strong policies and implementation of existing laws, we also have to make sure those laws do not end up violating or infringing other aspects of the freedom of religion or belief. And I feel this blanket prohibition against conversion of children under 18 might just do that.
It definitely requires a lot of nuance, and thank you for sharing that. I know we are short in time, so final question, Kashmala. Going through the legal needs assessment, there was a very interesting excerpt on how structural discrimination can be traced back to the very term of minority itself, and how it is further aggravated by this rhetoric of mazhabi aktariyat or mazhabi aqliyat. So iske upar agar aap, in closing, if you could talk more about that, please.
Yeah. So before I get to that, I would just like to add to Reema's comments. I think it was very efficiently kind of narrated about the whole thing, and it's also about coercion is a very important part of it. Even though if someone is not being dragged into come on, you know, convert kalma paro, it's about the little subtle coercion techniques that are happening, especially on like very young adults who have not fully comprehended about everything that goes on in their life. And also another aspect of this rhetoric that we hear very often about it's an NGO or Western propaganda. It's just that, okay, even if it is, then why are there only like forced conversions relating to marriage, like Reema said, or why is it always underage girls? Why isn't a 50-year-old woman who has seen a much greater part of her life is inclined towards Islam? Why doesn't she want to accept? Why aren't young boys accepting? Why aren't any boys accepting? So why is it only girls and why is it only marriage? And that raises a very important question: that is this a propaganda? Like, so what is your answer to that? I'm sorry, I just wanted to add that.
That's true.
And secondly, coming to the otherization, I think that kind of sum up of the legal needs assessment that we conducted. When we talk about why do you face this problem, it all stems from the authorization. It comes back to mazhabi aksariyat versus mazhabi akliyat. It becomes Muslims versus non-Muslim. Your identity becomes your religious belief. When we know that in identity politics, our identity can be based on a lot of things. It is gender, ethnicity, caste, language. It's not only religion. So why in Pakistan, I think mostly it just become like common rhetoric that our identity is what we practice. Furthermore, for example, when you say non-Muslims, the other person's identity is based off on my identity, right? He is what it.
Yeah.
Him not being a Muslim is not his identity. Being a Christian or a Hindu is his identity. So when we, that kind of very subtle discrimination, I think, which we're all actually really guilty of, because we use the term non-Muslims very easily. We think it's a respectful term. Even I did it, and I think I've spoken about it even in this like in the last hour conversation that we've had. I've used the word minority, which I've tried to like actively reduce the usage of. But why should someone else's identity be based on what they're not, on what I am and what they're not, right? So that is the major crux of it. We need to identify that these, because when you say non-Muslims, when you say akliyat, that just gives that there is a majority and then there's a minority. So when there's a majority, obviously they are on the upper pedestal than we are. And when we're all saying that, when we're all adding towards it, I think it adds to like very little subtle traces of discrimination that kind of then play out in the bigger picture. So even with our research, it is primarily, we have a lot of different things that we're doing as part of this project. We are actively trying to use the word religiously marginalized, religious communities, Hindu community, Sikh community, Christian community, rather than just saying, oh, they're non-Muslim, because that is not their identity. That is, I think it became very visible and very direct when I think a 20-year-old, 25-year-old in our focus group discussion said that, oh, why are you calling me a minority? I'm not a non-Muslim, I'm a Christian. And I think it's such a simple statement, but it covers such a wide range of what the whole issue is about. And I think a very poignant way for me to end this conversation. So I think my recommendation, although I know that laws should be amended, constitution needs to be amended, we all know that amending the constitution is a task in its own, but I think on an individual level, what we can start off is just to identify our own privilege and not base someone's identity on just a religious belief, and not base their identity on my belief per se. I think that's it from my end.
Thank you both for taking out the time to discuss this very important issue with us today. And this is an ongoing conversation that we look to continue in the future, perhaps in our studio if the pandemic allows. We also thank our viewers for joining us today. And if you found this conversation interesting, please do subscribe to our channel so that you can stay up to date with our webinars and podcasts. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you.